Chapter 3. Supernatural Civilization. The praying time lasted only half an hour. The believers gradually dispersed when the church bells rang, indicating the time. Merlin, on the other hand, was held back and directed to the small door of the church by the anxious Macy. Soon, both of them arrived in the backyard of the church. There, Merlin noticed about 20 people of different ages practicing swordsmanship under the guidance of a middle-aged man. Macy walked toward this middle-aged man uneasily and said in a low voice, "Lord Pero." The man in front was Swordsman Pero. He, who appeared about 30 years old, was dressed in a silver light armor. In his hand held a great sword with the width of 4 fingers. His eyes, which brimmed of a radiating vigor, imposed on him a dignified manner. Swordsman Pero glanced at Merlin and Macy before saying softly, "Get into formation." Macy was glad that Swordsman Pero did not punish them. Immediately, she and Merlin wormed their way into the crowd. Merlin was feeling rather confused when he joined the crowd. Just as he was at a loss of what to do, a red-haired young man waved at him from the back. "Merlin, hurry up." The red-haired young lad shouted at Merlin with an exaggerated expression. Merlin hesitated for a second. Soon, his memory reminded him of that red-haired young man, and hence he walked swiftly toward the young man. "Hey, Merlin, you're late again." Look at Swordsman Pero's annoyed face. "You're going to be in trouble." The red-haired young man mocked. Merlin frowned. It was not that he cared much about the punishment from Swordsman Pero. Instead, he was trying all his might to recollect the memory of the red-haired young man. Although his memory was partially lost, he had a strong memory of that red-haired man. Therefore, he tried really hard to recollect his memory, and gradually they came back to him in bits and pieces. The red-haired young man called Anson was Merlin's best friend, who was also a son of a baron. However, he was different from Merlin. He was not to inherit the baron title, as there were 2 elder brothers before him. Anson kept on talking, but Merlin, who was lost in his own thoughts, could not care much about what Anson was babbling on about. Just then, Swordsman Pero's eyes met theirs. Anson, who could not seem to stop chattering just seconds before, immediately shut his mouth and pulled on a serious face. Swordsman Pero then shifted his gaze and pointed to the racks of weapons near him. There were all sorts of weapons, including great swords, shields, daggers, sabers, great axes, and others. "Merlin, Anson, carry this iron shield to the center." Anson's face fell the moment Swordsman Pero spoke. He forced out a smile and turned to Merlin. "We're dead. You're the one who's late to practice, but I have to suffer your misfortune." Despite the grumble, Anson stood up quickly together with Merlin and went forward to the rack, ready to move that black iron shield. Even though its size was not too big, the shield was unusually heavy. Merlin and Anson strained every muscle on their body, but only managed to lift it up slightly. Merlin was puzzled. Who in the world could lift such a heavy shield? And what was the point if no one could lift it? Merlin and Anson were breathless when they finally moved the shield to the center and rested it against a boulder. They retreated to a side respectfully and waited for instructions from Swordsman Pero. However, Swordsman Pero ignored Merlin and Anson. He announced to the people below, "All of you have been practicing for a while now, and I shall test your strength today. Whoever thinks they can break this shield by hand are welcome to try." Merlin's facial expression changed slightly. Anson and he had exhausted themselves by moving the shield. It should be evident to the others on how hard and solid this iron shield was. Anyone who wanted to break this shield with their bare hands would definitely be asking for trouble. He thought Swordsman Pero only wanted to examine the courage of these people. "Teacher, I would like to try." Soon, a burly man stood up and said to Swordsman Pero. Swordsman Pero nodded and replied, "Well, go ahead, Cawthon." Anson whispered at the sight of the burly man, "It's Cawthon again." Just because he's a disciple of Swordsman Pero, he always puts on an air of grandeur as if he's above everyone else. Cawthon strode to the shield. He took a deep breath, clenched his fists, and began to gather his strength. Bang! Suddenly, Cawthon punched his fist forcefully onto the iron shield. The punch was extremely fast. It was shown that Cawthon had indeed exhausted all his might. But what was strange was that hint of white light that appeared around Cawthon's fist. The deafening sound lasted for a long time. Not only was the iron shield not broken, that powerful punch did not even leave any trace on its surface. Swordsman Pero shook his head and said faintly, "Cawthon, do not use brute force. Remember, elemental force is the most powerful. Use your heart to guide the elemental force. It's the mightiest force of an elemental swordsman." It was obvious that Cawthon was also dissatisfied with himself. He bowed to Swordsman Pero before returning to his seat. Cawthon has the talent, but it takes more to become an elemental swordsman. Anson laughed mockingly at Cawthon's failed attempt. Although Merlin appeared calm on the surface, intense surges of feelings and emotions washed through his heart. Even Merlin, who stood in a distance away, felt a gush of strong wind coming from the punch that Cawthon had just performed. The strength of that punch was so forceful it was terrifying. As far as Merlin knew, it was not a force that could be possessed by ordinary people. This was not the most surprising part. What surprised Merlin the most was that Cawthon was not injured at all after landing such a powerful blow on the sturdy iron shield. This was beyond the understanding of Merlin. Who else would like to try? Swordsman Pero once again looked at the crowd at his foot. "Lord Pero, let me try." The voice sounded familiar. Merlin's eyes narrowed as he realized it was his sister, Macy, who had just volunteered. Swordsman Pero nodded. "Well, Macy, go on." Macy hurried to the shield and winked mischievously at Merlin. As she took a deep breath, her rounded peaks moved up and down. Anson's eyes stared straight ahead at the spectacular sight. Bang! There came another loud noise. Macy had landed a punch not any weaker than Cawthon's. This time, Merlin studied very carefully. He noticed that an extremely faint glow of fire actually flashed around Macy's fist. The faint flame shrouded intermittently around Macy's fist. Just like Cawthon, the petite Macy also did not injure her hand after the punch. It was as though she did not strike her fist against a hard iron shield. However, Merlin, who just moved the shield, knew clearly that an iron shield of such a heavy weight was definitely made out of real iron. I don't have any recollection in my memory that Macy actually has such great strength. Is this even possible? Merlin felt that pieces of really important memories were lost from his mind. Is there anyone else that would like to try it out? Swordsman Pero asked once again, but this time no one stepped forward. Therefore, Swordsman Pero stood up slowly and walked toward the shield. He suddenly raised his voice. "Look closely. The real secret of an elemental swordsman is in the elements. The force of the elements is unparalleled. Only by carefully guiding the element that the exceptional power can erupt." As soon as his voice faded away, Swordsman Pero clenched his right fist. In the blink of an eye, a flame flared up directly out of his hand. His entire arm seemed to be wrapped in flames. Crack! Swordsman Pedro punched his fist into the shield. Almost immediately, that hard iron shield, like a wooden board, scattered on the ground into several pieces of iron scraps. Even the boulder behind the shield was affected under the powerful force, forming numerous dense cracks on the surface. This supernatural force. Merlin stared with his mouth open. His mind was in a state of complete blankness. Everything in front of him was beyond his cognition. The human body could actually emit flames, and the power of Swordsman Pero was comparable to a small-sized bomb. Initially, Merlin thought that the world he had crossed into was a very backward civilization. However, now, it seemed that this was not the case at all. The punch performed by Swordsman Pero earlier clearly proved that this world was a supernatural civilization. Chapter 4, Elemental Swordsmen. Merlin still had the dull look in his eyes as Anson, next to him, spoke in an envious tone. Swordsman Pero is getting more and more powerful. The impact he made last time was not even as strong. The chances are 10 to 1 that Swordsman Pero is going to succeed in becoming a second-level fire swordsman. Indeed, elemental affinity has a high influence on the cultivation progress. Swordsman Pero only cultivated for 3 years, and he will soon become a second-level fire swordsman. He's considerably one of the fastest in the church in Blackwater City. Fire swordsman? Merlin's heart jolted. He heard Swordsman Pero mentioning earlier the term elemental swordsman numerous times, but he had no idea what it actually meant. He thought it was just the way they addressed a person who practiced swordsmanship, but now it seemed there was more to that. Merlin's memory was only partially merged. Hence, many key memories were still unable to be retrieved. Among them was the memory related to this elemental swordsman. Merlin had no impression about it at all. He was eager to know everything about elemental swordsmen, but he also knew that he could not inquire directly without risk raising doubts from others. Therefore, he beat around the bush and asked Anson in a subtle manner. Fortunately, Anson did not suspect anything. Besides, he was a close friend of Merlin, so he revealed a lot of information inadvertently. It turned out that Swordsman Pero was not just another swordsman, but an elemental swordsman of a powerful force. In this world, many people were born with an elemental affinity. These people could absorb invisible elements in the surroundings into their body. When the degree of elements was accumulated to a certain level, the force could be guided out of the body by special methods and erupt into a powerful force. These people were called elemental swordsmen. Of course, swords were not the only necessary tool in introducing elements into the body. For instance, some people with an affinity to the wind element could become amazing hunters with the assistance of a strong bow. The reason why they were called elemental swordsmen was that the vast majority of people in this world utilized swords in this cultivation. Swordsman Pero was already a true fire swordsman. However, in the case of Cawthon and Macy, they only had the elemental affinity without yet the ability to completely guide the force of the elements out of the body, or perhaps the accumulation of elements inside the body was not enough. Hence, they could not be considered real elemental swordsmen. However, as long as they persevered in practice, they might become powerful elemental swordsmen on par with Swordsman Pero, who could perform such terrifying punch. Merlin felt really excited at the knowledge of this. Did it not mean that he could also possess such a powerful force? However, Anson's next words extinguished his hope. Merlin, elemental swordsmen are tremendously powerful, and their future is boundless. However, we don't have any elemental affinity. It is destined that we will never be an elemental swordsman. You might get off better as your sister Macy is one of them with a high affinity to the fire element. Perhaps she will turn out a fire swordsman in the future. On the other hand, you are the absolute heir to the Wilson family. Even if things don't turn out well for you in the time to come, you can easily become a baron. But what about me? I have 2 older brothers, so it's impossible for me to inherit to the title. Anson was getting low-spirited as he spoke about this and finally kept his mouth shut. No elemental affinity. It was as if Merlin had just been splashed with a bucket of cold water. He calmed down in an instant. According to Anson, elemental affinity was the key to becoming an elemental swordsman. For instance, Swordsman Pero, who had an affinity to the fire element, was able to introduce fire element into his body as his own power and eventually became a powerful fire swordsman. Generally, the stronger the elemental affinity, the easier it would be to introduce the elements into the body, thus becoming a swordsman. Swordsmen were divided into categories based on the different types of elements, including fire swordsmen, ice swordsmen, wind swordsmen, and many other. However, the noblest and the one with the brightest future were the light swordsmen that possessed affinity to the light elements. Once the light elements were absorbed into the body, the person would become a light swordsman. Almost every light swordsman would become a guardian swordsman of the Church of Light. They received help and support from the church, and their speed of cultivation was comparably quicker than other swordsmen. However, no matter what type of elemental swordsman, the elemental affinity was fundamental. People without elemental affinity would never become elemental swordsmen. Like Merlin and Anson, they precisely belonged to the class without any element affinity. The people who came to practice swordsmanship with Swordsman Pero were divided into 3 categories. The first ones were civilians who did not have any slightest background status. Each of them possessed elemental affinity and belonged to a higher class of people, so they were allowed here by the church. If they were fortunate enough to become an elemental swordsman, they would be taken in to join the armed forces of the church. Cawthon was one of the best among them. The second category was the children of the aristocratic, but the aristocrats that possessed elemental affinity. Compared to the civilians aforementioned, these aristocrats with high background statuses had a brighter future. Once they became elemental swordsmen, their families would send them to a larger city for further studies. Their future was promising. Macy belonged to this class of people. The third category was people like Merlin and Anson. They were also children of the aristocratic, but they have no elemental affinity, and that limited their achievements in the future. Although these 3 types of people practiced swordsmanship under Swordsman Pero, they were distinct from one another as each belonged to their own small circle. After a long time, Merlin thought of Cawthon, who had showcased his outstanding performance. He then whispered, "How about the elemental affinity of Cawthon? Cawthon? He is probably the most talented among us, because of his affinity to the light element. Once the light element is introduced into his body successfully, he will go leaps and bounds to become guardian swordsman of the church. He is definitely going places. He has already attracted the attention of the church, even though he has not yet become an elemental swordsman. Even Swordsman Pero has accepted him as a disciple. For him to become an elemental swordsman is only a matter of time." Anson glanced at Cawthon, who was in the front row when he finished speaking. His eyes showed a glint of envy. As if noticing Merlin was feeling quite disheartened, Anson murmured, "Cawthon is born a talent, but your sister Macy has a high potential too. She also has an affinity to the fire element, just like Swordsman Pero, so he will definitely spend effort in educating her. With Macy, your Wilson family will not decline in the next few decades. Compared to me, you'll be in a way better position in the future." Merlin had a sudden inspiration. He was surprised to learn his sister Macy had such extensive potential. Besides, as Anson mentioned earlier, it was noticeable that Swordsman Pero frequently checked on Cawthon and Macy from time to time, closely watching their cultivation process. This showed that he had high expectation on Cawthon and Macy.